Welcome to the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski, and today we're going to be hearing the powerful stories of 4 funeral professionals who were among the first people to arrive in New York City after the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. In the weeks and months that followed, they and scores of their funeral service colleagues worked tirelessly to meet with families, identify remains, and help the community begin its painfully difficult grief journey. 20 years later, their often untold stories are as powerful as they were 2 decades ago. Thank you to each of them for joining me today and for sharing the experiences and emotions that emerged as they worked tirelessly to help families begin to heal after unfathomable loss. First, I'm joined by Christie Whitaker, a funeral director at Whitaker Funeral Home in Newberry, South Carolina, who drove up to New York City just days after the attacks. Welcome, Christie, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Tell us about the morning of September 11th, 2001, Christie. How did your day begin?
My day began with a very pleasant morning, or a very pleasant few hours early in the morning, and then a phone call. And my day changed drastically after a few hours. That a day and a change that I will never forget.
When did you first learn that the World Trade Center had been hit by the first plane?
I believe it was approximately 9 a.m. in the morning, and I actually was having a leisure morning in my hotel room and got a phone call. And I actually believed it to be a test call because of some training I had been a part of earlier in the month, and could not believe what they were telling me, trying to get the television set on, and finally realized that I was not being challenged with a test call. I was actually experiencing the reality of what we had been practicing. So it was a different day from that point on.
Tell us about the rest of that day, the events that led up to you traveling to New York, when you found out you were going, what that trip was like.
The day unfolded slowly and rapidly. It's difficult to describe all of the events that happened. I had to wait until the support team could make all of the necessary arrangements for us to be able to get in. And so many of our team members were in different parts of the country. So finally, about, I would say 7 o'clock that evening, I was called and told to meet a support team coming up from Washington at the airport and help bring cars into the city because we would be needing transportation. And, of course, needless to say, nothing was available in the area for us to be able to secure at that particular time, or who knew what was available. And, of course, as we went through the day, listening to all of the people who were there in the hotel and everyone trying to get information and wondering what was going on, it was one of those, I don't even know that I have a word to describe exactly the feelings of everyone, because the disbelief of what everyone was hearing was just overwhelming for all of us. Then, of course, meeting the support team, and we each drove a car. So we drove like 10 cars into New York that evening, that night. So each of us were in a separate car. And I can remember riding up that highway, nothing happening, we were the only cars on the highway, total darkness, and just wondering, what am I driving into? What is going to be this sight that I see when I get there? It was eerie, overwhelming, and I must say, I think I shed tears during that drive because I had family. I was leaving family behind, and who knew what was going to happen next?
So you volunteered to go into this situation that you had no idea what to expect when you got there, and this was something that we'd never seen on this scale in this country before. What was your specific role once you got to New York City?
My position within the DMORT arena was to oversee family assistance. My role when I got there was to meet initially with the medical examiner to decide how we could best support the work that was being done there in New York in order to facilitate in any way that we possibly could gathering information as to those who had become victims of the incident, and also to gather information that could possibly lead to some kind of positive identification. As the day unfolded, I discovered that I was going to be working with the airlines, so I left the medical examiner's office. I met with both American and United Airlines via phone, basically. Well, they had two representatives on site, but most of our work was done via telephone. And we were charged with setting up a telephone care center there in a local hotel in order to speak with the families of those souls who perished on the flights during this horrible incident. And challenge was tremendous. The good news is we had people who, many funeral directors, so many funeral directors who have compassion and care and concern, and were absolutely fantastic in making these calls to these families and being able to gather information that hopefully would help in providing information that would lead to a positive identification, either of remains if they were available, or of personal effects, because personal effects become so significant to families.
Christie, you said that you were there with a team, and the team was, I believe, called DMORT. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what they do?
Sure. DMORT is an acronym for Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team, and it's composed of numerous professionals in many areas: forensic specialists, funeral directors, odontologists, medical examiners. It's such a diverse team. It was such a diverse team. And we came together, and depending on the needs of the incident, we determined what type of team, what particular specialties would need to be sent out to support the community, to support the different resources, police, medical, whatever, and helping to mitigate the situation and predominantly provide identification in many incidents when a disaster happened.
And how long was there a funeral director's presence in New York after the attacks?
Following the attacks, even as DMORT personnel began to have less numbers present, local funeral directors from across this country through NFDA volunteered to go in and support all of the efforts that were being done there. So it was months that funeral directors had a presence in New York City, many months.
Can you describe what you experienced when you first came upon Ground Zero?
My initial reaction was speechless. I could not comprehend standing in Ground Zero and looking around me, because it was as if I had been transported into some movie scene, and this couldn't be a reality, because in this country we didn't have realities of that nature. I just could not, I couldn't even absorb the emotions at that particular time, because the reality was overwhelming at the moment. It didn't take me long to realize that it was real, that I was standing at ground zero, and the emotions did come. And I must say that when I went there each evening to just ascertain what supplies we may need, how the people who were working there that were a member of my team, making sure that they were all still okay, the tears would flow. I would return to my hotel in the wee hours of the morning. I would sit in the middle of my bed and I would weep as I read cards that friends were sending to the hotel to support me. So the moment of unbelief quickly became days and weeks of reality.
And as you said, this was overwhelming. The whole nation was grieving. We were in shock. And you were there to help these families get through this terrible, terrible tragedy. Even for someone who deals with grief on a daily basis like yourself, where did your strength come from? Who was there for you?
Well, I had support team members, and we had become a family. We truly became family in the greatest of ways. I had 2 New York police individuals, NYPDs, who drove me each day. One would drive me during the morning into the afternoon, and the other one would pick me up from whatever location and drive me from the afternoon until the wee hours of the morning. Those 2 young men were my confidant, my everything. They meant the world to me because it was just the 2 of us in those cars, and I could actually talk about what I was feeling. I had support from my family, and my family had people sending cards, as I said earlier, and just knowing that they were making sure that anything that could be a support to me was being done, and I knew they had a lot of prayers going on for me as well.
So as you look back on your experiences 20 years ago, what are the memories that have stayed with you the most? Are there families that you still think about today?
Yes, there are. I think about my 2 gentlemen who drove me everywhere and their families. I think about a particular family that whose daughter was one of the souls that perished on a flight, and my opportunity to meet with them and share time with them. I think about the young man who was the hotel evening clerk and would greet me in the wee hours of the morning with a smile on his face. And I think about the gentleman who opened the door for me in those wee hours of the morning as I came in and would greet me with a smile and care in his voice. And I think about all of those families of the people I worked with and the sacrifices that they were making during the time that we were there in the city. And, of course, I can still see the faces of so many of the New Yorkers who were working tirelessly trying to take care of whatever the needs may be. I see the faces of the firemen standing on the pit. I see the faces of ministers at Ground Zero. I have lots of memories. Those memories are special memories at this point. And you know, I've never wanted to go back to Ground Zero. I've not been back into New York since I left. And I don't really have a desire to go back at this point, and I'm not sure why. It feels that way, but that's who I am today.
How did this change you as a person, Christie?
I think perhaps it made me appreciate family more than I ever had before. It also made me recognize the reality of how precious life is and how it can change so drastically in such horrible ways. And it was something, perhaps my easy life was something I had always taken for granted, and this was a reality that we are gifted. We are so blessed and gifted with all that we have, but it doesn't mean it's always going to be easy and that the gift's always going to be the same, and anything can happen at any time, not anticipating it to be of this magnitude or of this horrible nature. But it certainly makes me appreciate the life that I have each day.
I'm guessing that most people, like myself, have or had no idea regarding the role funeral professionals played in helping communities and families following these attacks. I think of you as humble warriors, but there has to be a great sense of pride for you to know that you were able to come into this unimaginable situation and actually make a difference.
Well, thank you for the way you described us as humble warriors. That's beautiful. Thank you. I'm honored by your description. I am so proud. I am so very, very proud of the funeral directors across this country and their dedication every day to being a humble warrior. So please know that I know these funeral directors every day in their lives as they're serving families are humble warriors. What they did in rising to the occasion with this incident and other incidents that we have been a part of is spectacular. And I am so thankful that there are those people out there who care, who were willing to make a difference in this horrible incident, and I was honored to be a part of that. I truly was.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your experience that maybe we're not aware of or you just want to share?
I worked with unbelievable people. I experienced unbelievable experiences, and I left New York changed. I believe with a much better change, and I will never forget. I will always remember my days through this incident, and I will always remember the opportunities of standing with families and remembering with families and all of the ceremonies that happened. I'm changed, I'm humbled, and I'm scarred to some degree, and I can never hear certain songs without tearing today. But I feel blessed, absolutely blessed, that I got to be a part of it and that I also got to return home to a family and a community that continues to love me.
Beautiful. Christie, I ask all of my guests, who are you remembering today?
Well, the list would be long if I tried to tell you who I'm remembering today. But I'm remembering the world today. I'm remembering the change in the world. I'm remembering how this one incident perhaps changed all of us in this world. And I am truly remembering my caring family. Always will.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Christie, and for opening your heart and sharing your stories and for doing what you do. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
John Carmon, a funeral director and president of Carmon Community Funeral Homes in Connecticut, spent 3 weeks in New York City, and in the months that followed made approximately 15 trips back to the city to work with families and assist city officials in the recovery efforts. At the time, John was president of the National Funeral Directors Association, the world's largest funeral service association, which provides support to funeral directors around the world. Welcome, John, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Holly, and thank you for doing this.
Hard to believe we're looking at the 20th anniversary of that terrible day on September 11th, 2001. Can you tell us about that morning and how your day began?
actually, I should tell you about the day before, because I was in Washington, D.C., representing NFDA. It had been a year since the association had worked with the federal agencies and got the government to agree that they would provide military honors to any veteran who died and provide two members of the service that they were part of to fold the flag, present it to the family, and play taps. And they had asked me to come where they had VSOs and representatives from all the different branches of the service to speak about the significance of what this had meant to so many families in that past year. So that afternoon, I spoke to over 450 people that were gathered for that, and then afterwards made a few visits to some of the congressional representatives that had helped us make this legislation possible, and then actually took the last flight out of Washington, D.C. that night at 9 o'clock to come home. Then the next morning was in the office, in my office at 7:30 in the morning, when, of course, we all got word of what had happened in New York City.
When you first learned that the World Trade Center had been hit by a plane and we were looking at a tragedy, did you have an inkling that you'd be making a trip to New York City?
Right at that point, no. That then when word came out of the plane and what it was, my daughter-in-law's father was a pilot who normally was flying that plane. And so, of course, the concern I had, and later found out that someone had taken his place earlier, so there, many emotions. Because of the significance of this, I gathered all our staff at the funeral home for prayer, and just to talk with them, and told them that, that they were free to go home to their families and children if they had young folks at home and everything that hopefully were going to be brought back from school.
This is still obviously very emotional for you, and it hit you very hard, and you're in a business where you're dealing with grief and sorrow every day, but this was on a scale we'd never seen before in this country. Tell us about when you arrived in New York City, and what was your specific role there?
NFDA had been working with a public relations company, and they knew that there would be a lot that we could do to provide, both assistance and information. And there were many forums where, people would be asked for information, expert witnesses, things like that. And so we went there to do that in the very beginning. And it was obviously extremely emotional. One of the sessions that I remember the most was we were gathered in a studio, and there were about 60 of us representing all walks of life. I remember one of the fire chief's son, who the fire chief had not been found yet, and his son was there holding his dad's helmet, and there were members of the clergy. I remember sitting next to a rabbi. There were teachers, and they also web streamed in in fact, I remember Senator McCain. He was webbed in, and, so we had interactive discussions about all of this and everything that was going on. And I remember talking specifically, we have a full-time center for grieving children and families called Mary's Place. So we're particularly sensitive to the needs of young children, especially those between 3 through teen years. And so we had some discussion about, this effect on children and, how parents could talk with children and what kinds of things that they could do to help them to work through this. Often children are thought of as the forgotten grievers, and because they appear to go about their normal activities and play and do other things, but sometimes are, quiet about their feelings and how they might be able to draw them out and make sure that they express themselves.
John, what was your reaction upon seeing Ground Zero for the first time? Were you prepared for that?
I don't know if anyone could be adequately prepared for that. I remember just the enormity of it. I remember being with the head of DMORT as he guided me through and explained the different things and what was being done. I remember just wanting to drop down on one knee and to pray at that spot for all these people and people that still had not been found or people who had not been recovered, and just wanting to touch the ground and the significance and the enormity of that. I mean, it was just a very emotional experience. I had the chance as well to bring Rabbi Earl Grolman, who had spent years working with children in grief, and Earl wanted to come down and see if there was any help that he could provide. And so I brought Earl to New York and introduced him to everyone, and some of the folks that were providing counseling and everything else, if there was some way that he could provide materials or other things that would particularly help with children. And I can remember Earl just tears flowing, with what was, what you were experiencing and feeling.
So you were there as an expert in the funeral profession, and I understand you did quite a number of media interviews. You coordinated funeral director volunteers. You also had informal interactions with people, creating something you called honor rituals. Can you explain what that was?
Yes. One of the things that happened was that there were so many people that knew nothing, there was no word. They didn't know about their relatives, their friends, their husbands, wives, or people that were in the trade center and what had happened to them. And so they would post their photographs on the wall of the medical examiner's office down on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. And then they would go back and visit those pictures to see if anyone left a message that they had heard of anyone or seen anyone, because families were separated and, they just didn't know where they were. So at that, sometimes you'd begin to talk with people there, and all of a sudden a crowd would gather. And I can remember talking to, a small family unit, and then all of a sudden 3 or 4 more people would come, and then a few more people would come, and pretty soon there was 35 people on the sidewalk all gathered. And as I explained to one family how they could create a ritual at home or around their dining room table, and to light a candle and maybe hold hands and either just share remembrances or pray together if that was their tradition, to just do something that brought structure to this event, because it was so catastrophic and people just didn't understand, and there was so little information that was available.
So important at a time where people feel out of control and so helpless, I would imagine. And I understand that you also helped provide honors for one of the service dogs who was killed that day. How did that come about?
Well, this was several weeks after the beginning, when it occurred, but I was there at the medical examiner's office, and we had coordinated help for them to help in their recovery efforts and also documentation. And we had volunteers there for 2 weeks at a time, and in visiting them and some of the DMORT folks, while we were there, we got word that they had discovered a service dog that had died and that they had notified the handler and police officer, and this dog had been with him, as I remember, for 6 or 7 years, so they were very close. And he arrived, and the ambulance that would bring the service dog to the medical examiner's office from ground zero was escorted by the New York City Police Department, motorcycles, and cruisers, just as anyone that they discovered, and brought to the medical examiner's office. And the dog had been draped with the American flag, and after bringing the dog out of the ambulance, I was asked to fold and present the flag with one of the DMORT volunteers to the dog's handler. And that was an emotional event, and very much so for the police officer who had lost, like a member of his own family.
That's beautiful. I can imagine, what a lovely final gift for not only the dog, but his handler. So day in and day out, you are helping these families on a much larger scale than you normally do in your everyday profession. It's got to take a toll, even for someone, as experienced as you. You had to be strong for these families, but we were all grieving. Everyone was grieving. You were grieving. How did you remain strong? Where did your strength come from?
Well, from my faith, I have a very strong faith, and as a strong Christian, I would rely on that and would pray daily and pray with families that wish that. The other thing that was very important was that we were still serving families every day who were having, and how do you say this, a normal death. Their mother, dad, husband, wife died after having a heart attack or sickness or something else, and yet those deaths were still extremely significant for their families. And yet with what was going on in the country and with everyone grieving the loss of so many people at the Trade Center and so many first responders and everything else, you had to make sure that our staff and all of us still treated with the importance and the significance of these people that were experiencing, normal deaths in their family. And so that was very important, because sometimes people would even say, well, with what other people are experiencing, our loss is not that significant. And I mean, people would say that, and we had to make sure that they felt that was not the case, that they had to receive the same care and detail and everything with what they needed to not only celebrate that life and honor the person that died, but also to validate, their feelings of loss.
Every loss is significant, no matter what scale. And so many of the funeral directors who came out there, they volunteered their time. They took vacation from work without hesitation. They just traveled from probably, across the country to help out. What does it mean to you to be a part of a profession that gives so selflessly to others in times like tragedy?
I was so proud of our profession. serving as the president of the National Funeral Directors Association at the time, I got phone calls from literally all over the United States. How can I help? What can I do? And hundreds of people just wanted to give of their time. And so we were able, with the help of the association executives, to be able to work out something with the medical examiner of how we could help them so that it would be significant. And, it required that 2-week minimum stay. And the association, who had received donations from around the country, was able to use those funds to provide the housing for these volunteers so that they had a place to stay. And there were so many agencies there, the Salvation Army, the Red Cross, and among many others who provided meals and everything else. So meals were never an issue. These people were true volunteers. I think the only maybe other real volunteers were the cheerleaders, which was a group of people who every day, every hour of every day, they just came as volunteers from all over the city and stood in the median of the road where everyone would leave ground zero when they had either finished their shifts or their time there and everything else, and they would just clap and cheer for them, just to thank them for being there. And that was a very significant group of people that I'll never forget. And in several presentations that I made at 9/11 observances, and even several years following that, I would tell the story of these cheerleaders, because they were like blessings from God, just because they were there out of the goodness of their heart to just say thank you to all these people without any thanks themselves or no schedule, they weren't on anything. They just showed up to do this 24 hours a day for months.
A bright spot in a very dark time.
It was as if God was reaching down to tell these workers that it's going to be all right.
As you look back on these past 20 years, what memories stayed with you the most? Are there families that you still think about?
Yes, but it's like when something is so fresh and raw, sometimes that it looks so terrible. I mean, everything is so terrible. And then after time, and you seem to look at it from a distance, it's like even at the time looking at the New York skyline with the clouds of smoke that went on for weeks, after the collapse of the towers and everything, how terrible and how awful that was. And now, as you look at the New York skyline and look at it from a distance, it seems though it's peaceful, it's beautiful, it's changed just like time has helped to change. And while many people are still terribly grieving that event and the loss that they have had, that hopefully that time gives you a different perspective to be able to see it in a healing way, or a way that there's been some healing. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. John, I ask all of my guests this. Who are you remembering today?
Well, there are several families that we served who lived in our area, even though we're up in Hartford County and Tolland County and in Connecticut. But there were people that used to travel and work in the trade center. I never forget those people, and also relatives of friends that have been friends for years. In one case was a sister, and so we always remember her. But every death is significant, and as many people do when they have a loss in their own family, go back and think of some of these other tragedies. We were very involved in the terrible shootings at Sandy Hook in Newtown, Connecticut, with the children, and we cared for the children at our facility and helped the funeral directors that were there providing the services. And any of those tragedies, they just bring back that whole raft of emotions and feelings that that are so significant. And as funeral directors, just because we do this every day, and I've been a funeral director for 53 years and grew up in a funeral home as a child, living over the second floor, you never get hardened to people's loss and the families that you're caring for and what they're going through. I think the day that I do is the day that I need to retire.
Thank you so much for joining me today, John, and for sharing your stories and your compassion and your beautiful heart. And on behalf of your country, thank you for everything you and your funeral service colleagues have done to help families, communities, the nation, for helping us heal in the last 20 years. Your work is invaluable.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think funeral service, if it's done with care and compassion, can provide communities ways that they can deal with many losses, not just death, but that where they can teach communities to come together, to support one another, to show love and understanding. That's the importance and what sets us apart and our society here, that we care about other people, and we need to show them that care and compassion.
Absolutely. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Next, I'm joined by Bryant Hightower, a funeral director at Martin and Hightower Funeral Home in Carrollton, Georgia. Like most of the funeral directors who volunteered their time, Bryant arrived in New York City unsure of the role he would play in the recovery, but ready to serve in whatever capacity was needed. Welcome, Bryant, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Holly, for having me. It's my pleasure.
Hard to believe it's been 20 years since that terrible, terrible day. Can you please tell us about the morning of September 11th? I know we all pretty much remember exactly what we were doing and where we were. How did your day begin?
Yeah, Holly, I do remember it pretty vividly. It started just like any other day. My children were small, and part of our morning routine was for me to get them ferried off to school while the wife straightened up by the house behind us before heading off to work herself. So I had delivered the kids to school and was at the office. We have a television in the office, and oftentimes we'd gather the morning news, and it might stay on for a little while. And we were all in the office and heard of some things going on. Somebody got a text from someone, I think, reporting something. So we flipped the TV on, and we're actually watching the TV when the second plane hit the World Trade.
Tell us about the rest of your day. You're watching this unfold. You see it happen. What is going through your mind at this time?
Just the horrific loss of life. I mean, as you could see those buildings tumble to the ground, you knew that there had been a tremendous loss of life and such a senseless act. And with the attack taking place not only in New York but in Washington and in Pennsylvania as well, you just really felt for the families of those who had lost their lives, and really just reflected on the loss of life that we had all seen unfold in front of our eyes, and it was just a tragedy. So it really clouded the rest of our day. I'd been a part of DMORT for some time when that occurred, and and realized that there might be the potential for a DMORT deployment as a result of the attacks, but just kind of waited on that to unfold. But the rest of the day was just very surreal, as I remember it.
You just mentioned DMORT. Could you please explain what that is and the role that they play in tragedies like this?
Sure. The acronym DMORT stands for Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team, and it's a federal entity that came about some 25 or so years ago, I would suspect, that has the capability of assisting local assets in time of disaster. They have the ability to set up a temporary morgue, operate family assistance centers, and it's a multifaceted team, and it is really a team approach made up not only of funeral directors and embalmers, but forensic anthropologists, pathologists, forensic odontologists, radiologists. So it really brings to bear a lot of different specialties to augment the ability of an individual jurisdiction to respond in times of mass fatality events. And I'd been a part of DMORT, I guess, for 4 or 5 years, maybe or so, by the time 9/11 hit.
So you arrived in New York City 2 days later on September 13th. What was your specific role in New York City?
It changed over time because I was there off and on for the better part of about 3 months. My time there lasted well beyond Thanksgiving. Originally, I was in what's called a family assistance center. As you know, a lot of the people who were involved, especially those who were passengers on those planes, their families were spread all across the country. And part of our initial job, or my job, along with other members of my team and some volunteers from the state of New York, was to contact those families of those passengers to kind of answer questions they might have had about what was going on the ground, because as you can imagine, they had a lot of questions about the process, what was going on. They were seeing things on the news, but they weren't being given individual information. And so we were kind of a conduit, if you will, for them for information on the ground. If they had questions, we tried to get them answers. We also tried to elicit some information from them, not knowing what the recovery efforts might look like and our ability to eventually be able to return remains back to their families. So we were gathering some ante-mortem information from those families as a part of our interaction with them. That was initially my job, and then later on I worked at the medical examiner's office with a team of detectives, also was positioned at the temporary morgue down at Ground Zero for a time. So I worked in several different areas over the 2 or 3 months that I was there.
You're used to dealing with loss pretty much every day, but on a much smaller scale. How did you help these families that have experienced this loss, this terrible loss? How were you able to have these difficult conversations day after day after day?
You're right. We do deal with death on a daily basis, and I think that did prepare us to have these conversations. We have these conversations on a daily basis, but we generally don't go from one conversation to another conversation to another conversation. I mean, we were literally talking to, a dozen families a day, and just, again, trying to offer them information, trying to offer them answers to questions that they might have had, and offering them, in some instances, some hope. We certainly didn't know what the recovery efforts might look like early on. We didn't know what the ability to return those remains would be, and it was evident very early on that that's what they wanted. They knew the loss of life that had taken place, but they very desperately wanted something to be returned. And in some instances, that was possible. In other instances, it may not have been possible, but they very much wanted that in order to move forward. And that became evident because it wasn't a one-time conversation we'd have with these families. There was one lady who I had a conversation with who, and if you don't mind, I'll tell you a little of this story. I think it kind of points to some of what they were going through. There was a lady that I talked to in one of my first conversations, and she was feeling very guilty. And the reason for her guilt was she had a daughter who was on the West Coast who was getting married. And she and her husband had agreed that they could only afford for one of them to make the trip to California. So the husband had bought a little video camera and told his wife, look, you go. She wants you there. You need to be there as the mom of the bride. You go, record the event, come back, and you and I'll share it. Well, as time went on, she began to feel very guilty about his inability to attend the wedding. And she cleared the attic, had some yard sales, raised the funds, and bought him a ticket unbeknownst to him. She made a gift of that to him, and he was in the second plane to hit World Trade. She felt very guilty because had she left well enough alone, he would not have been on that plane. And so she was dealing with a lot of guilt and angst in some of my first conversations. In some subsequent conversations, she had come to some realization. She had dealt with her grief as best she could, and she had come to the realization, and these are her words, I'll paraphrase as I remember them, that she had come to the realization that God didn't take things from you without giving you a gift in return. And I just thought that insight was amazing to have gone through what she had gone through and come out with that kind of revelation. So I'm pulling into work some probably 4 or 5 months later, and I remember this like it was yesterday. She had my cell phone number because if you heard something on the news and you weren't sure if it was true, we tried to give them a way of contacting us so that we could get them accurate information. So my phone rings one morning as I'm pulling into office. I've been back from New York now for several months, and I answered the phone, and she said, "Is this Bryant?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And she gave me her name, and I said, "Yes, ma'am, how are you doing?" And she said, "I'm doing really well." And she said, "I want to remind you of a conversation that we had." And I said, "Okay." She said, "Do you remember me telling you that I came to the realization that, God didn't take things from us without giving us a gift in return?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I remember how awestruck I was by that comment. And she said, "Well, I've gotten my gift." And I said, "You have? What is it?" And she said, "I got a call yesterday from my daughter in California, the one that got married." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "She's having twins." And I said, "Really?" And so those are the kinds of relationships. I had a couple of other people who I stayed in contact with for a few months after leaving New York. So that was the kind of relationships you were able to build over the phone. And I've wished so often that I could have reached out and hugged them. I've wished that I could have sat down with them over the kitchen table and shared a cup of coffee. But they really needed somebody to talk to who could offer them accurate information and who just kind of understood the parameters of what they were trying to deal with. And I think we were able to fill part of that role for them. And I've wondered so often how they've continued to deal with that horrific loss.
That's amazing and clearly very powerful. It stayed with you all these years. The entire country was mourning this terrible tragedy, and it had to be daunting even for a seasoned professional like yourself. How did you cope with the loss? Who was there for you?
There was a psychologist as a part of our DMORT team, so we were able to be debriefed. And sometimes you just felt like you needed to talk to somebody to unload, and so he was always available for us, and he moved around throughout the team. And if he saw you, saw that glazed look in your eye, sometimes he'd pull you aside and he'd say, "Let's go share a cup of coffee. Let's talk a little bit." So that was always available to us. The toughest part, I think, of going through this grief with these families was that when we do it on a daily basis at home, we're able to go home to our families at night and kind of regenerate ourselves and kind of rejuvenate our ability to go forward tomorrow. We were estranged from our families for that length of time. They were back home with some idea of what we were dealing with, but really probably not really to the extent that we were dealing with it, did they have any idea what was going on. So anyway, I think that's the part I missed. We were able to share with each other. We were all going through the same thing as members of the DMORT team and other responders. I bonded with several New York detectives who I worked side by side with for almost a month in the medical examiner's office. So we were able to share as well. But you did miss the contact to your family and the ability to share with them to some degree what your day had been like. I talked to my wife just about every day while we were there, and, you didn't want to load her up with all this stuff, so you didn't want to burden her with it, but she was always there for me to talk to as well, and sometimes she could tell in my voice what was going on, and so, she'd kind of drag it out of me a little bit, so it kind of helped to get rid of that, but you knew you were there to do a job, and that you knew the job was more important than your own feelings, and so, we just went about every day trying to do the best job we could.
You shared one story with us. Are there other families or memories that really stick with you?
There is. There's another story. The ante-mortem information that we gather, DMORT uses a computer program that takes all the ante-mortem information that we gather, and then when there is a recovery made, there's a post-mortem inventory made as well, and it's things like hair color, any visible tattoos or scars, jewelry, those kinds of questions questions that are asked, eye color, those kinds of things. And hopefully what you're trying to do is, as a recovery is made, you begin to narrow the scope so that you're able to return this person's loved one back into their care. And in one of the early conversations I had, there was a lady who I talked to, and her husband's wedding band had a specific inscription in it. And I logged that into my antemortem information sheet, and then I got transferred down to the ME's office. And our job, along with those detectives, was to take all this information that was gathered on the antemortem side, it had been put into the computer, and take some of the postmortem information that was being gathered at the ME's office and try to find matches so that they could begin to do more in-depth study to do a positive ID. And I had a file in front of me trying to put this information in, and I happened to notice one of the things that was logged as personal effects was this ring, and the inscription was in the description phase of the ring, and it joggled something. So I was able to go back, and I had done the initial interview with this lady and logged in that information and was able to be the one that found the file. And so there were remains that we were ultimately able, the ME's office was able to positively identify, and we were able to return her husband's remains to her and her small child. And that just gave me such a feeling of accomplishment, because there were so many families we weren't able to do that for. But in this specific case, we were able to help this lady find, a new journey in her grief experience, because she was able to put her husband to rest.
To give her that very important closure.
Absolutely.
That is amazing, yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share, or anything else you'd like us to know about that time in our history?
I think the members of DMORT and the other responders to that mass fatality event probably are the unsung heroes of 9/11. Certainly the MOS, the members of service, the fire department, and the police department that were down there at Ground Zero doing the recovery deserve every bit of credit they can be given. But there were volunteers from the New York State Funeral Directors Association, the Metropolitan Funeral Directors Association, and certainly members of DMORT that were on the ground every day trying to help families and help those other first responders through this event. And my hat just goes off to them, because there were folks there that stayed there long after I left that continued to do that work. And, without them, I think it would have been a much more daunting task for all of those folks in New York City. The ME's office did a phenomenal job. They have tremendous resources. But I think the things that DMORT were able to bring to bear made their job somewhat easier, and probably was able to allow them to continue to do some of the other work they needed to do. I mean, just because of 9/11, the other instances in and around New York didn't stop happening. There certainly was, a curtailing of some of the more violent crimes there for a time, but you still had natural deaths occurring. You still had, homicides. You still had suicides. You still had some of those things that an ME's office deals with on a daily basis. So not only were they dealing with the effects of the 9/11 events, but they were still dealing with everything that they dealt with on a daily basis. So, I think we were able to take some of the pressure off of them. And so my hat, again, just goes off to all those people that were there.
Life does go on, yeah.
It did.
Bryant, I ask all of my guests, who are you remembering today?
My thoughts are with all those families who lost loved ones on that tragic day. Having talked to so many of them, I could feel their pain come through the phone. I know that there's not been a day that's gone by that they haven't relived that loss. And I know on this special anniversary, the loss will seem even more real. So my thoughts, prayers are with all of those families today.
Thank you for joining me today, Bryant, and for sharing those very difficult stories. We so appreciate the work that you do, the compassion that you show in your work. It's very important every day to serve grieving families.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure to join you.
Dominic Carella, soon to be managing partner of Donahue Cesare Funeral Home in Westbury, New York, was one of the first funeral directors to arrive at Ground Zero following the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. In the months that followed, he would serve more than 75 families who experienced the devastating loss of a loved one that day. Welcome, Dominic, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning, and thank you.
Can you walk us through the morning of September 11th, 2001, Dominic? How did your day begin?
It was a normal day for me, up at 5, an hour and a half commute into New York City. Start my work day at 7:30 in the morning. It just was, I'll never forget, seemed like a beautiful fall day outside. You know, skies were clear. It was a great ride into the city. And it was somewhat of a slow day for us at the funeral home. We only had one service. We had a number of people that were still on vacation, so we were a little short-staffed. But the day just started out as any normal day in New York City would. And, you know, very simple and very basic.
So you were already driving into the city. When did you first learn that the World Trade Center had been hit by a plane?
Well, I was already in the city. I was already in my office, and we had got word that something happened at the World Trade Center. And it was about maybe 8:30, something like that in the morning, maybe 8:45. And we put the radio on, and, you know, they said that looks like a small plane might have hit the World Trade Center. And, you know, that part of New York City, they had the banner flights that carry the banners and so forth. So we all said the same thing in the office, so it must be one of those planes that carry the ads, and, you know, they'll take care of it. And then they started talking about the fire on the radio, that it looked much larger, and it was increasing as far as, you know, the amount of fire. And we noticed a lot of activity with the fire and police department. Now, we're on the Upper East Side, so there was quite a distance between Upper East Side and downtown Manhattan as far as distance. And we said that's kind of odd that, you know, the guys from up here look like they're going down Fifth Avenue responding to the World Trade Center. But we didn't think anything of it. We went about our business. And with that said, you know, we were listening to the radio, and when we all looked at one another, and it was about, I'm going to say, probably about 20 minutes later, that a second plane crashed into the World Trade Center. And, you know, we all looked stunned at one another, and everyone said the same thing. This has to be some type of an attack, and something odd is going on. And we had no TV or anything, so we were just listening to the radio. And unfortunately, it was the second plane hitting the South Tower, only to find out probably about 20 minutes later after that, now a plane hit the Pentagon. So everybody was kind of just shocked and stunned. I think the first thought that came to everybody's mind were family and friends that were there. And you're basically helpless at that point. I mean, all you could do is listen, and it was difficult to make phone calls if you did have friends or family there to find out if they were okay, because cell phones were cut off pretty quick. And then we just started witnessing more and more fire, police, ambulances all coming from the Upper East Side, all heading downtown. And we just looked at one another and we said, you know, this is not good. At the same time, I had a funeral director coming back from Brooklyn who was on the Brooklyn Bridge coming back to Manhattan. And he called me, which it took him quite a while to get through, and said to me, you know, I'm going to turn around. He says, there's no way. He said, looks like they're going to close the bridge and head home. He lived in Staten Island. So he goes, but I could see the two towers are on fire. He goes, traffic's not moving, and, you know, there's just fire trucks passing me left and right. So I said, okay, not a problem, you know, go home, you know, be safe, call me when you get home. And then the day, you know, unfortunately, at that point, we all kind of just sat around in the office. There was not too much to do, and we were just listening to the horrific reports coming in on the radio.
As a funeral director, did you instinctively know that my services are going to be needed in this space during this attack? Did you go there on your own? Were you asked to travel there?
Yeah, no, to be honest with you, that never came to my mind, because New York City has one of the highest fire departments in the world and police departments. I knew if anybody can do it, they did it once before. The death part did not cross my mind. It was more, you know, shock as far as, oh, my God, these poor people. And then it was like, okay, you know, this is going to be the world's greatest rescue right now going on. So none of that crossed my mind, probably until it was, I believe, almost an hour later at about 10 o'clock when the first tower went down, that's when we said, oh my God, what's going to happen? You figure, I think at the time there might have been 50,000 working in each tower, even if half of them got out and half of them didn't, you're looking at a lot of death. We were just assuming, we were just small talking and trying to pass the time. It wasn't until later that day, it was probably about 4:30 in the afternoon, that I got two back-to-back phone calls, one from the mayor's office, who was Mayor Giuliani. One of his aides called me to say, Father Judge has passed away, and he was close friends with the mayor. We're going to want you to take care of things for us. And then the second phone call was with the Archdiocese, which I was basically their funeral director for the Cathedral of St. Patrick's. And they asked me to get down to the medical examiner as soon as possible so we can get Father Judge out of there and, start preparing. So without hesitation, myself and one of the funeral directors that I worked with for many years, Martin Colibus, said, let's get in the car, let's get down there and see what's going on, only to find out we only had one van, that it was with the gentleman who I sent to Brooklyn earlier. So we had the former president of the facility, Gene Schultz. He had a station wagon. So I immediately ran to his office and said, Gene, if I can borrow your car for an hour. Father Judge has passed away. We've been called upon. I need to get down to the medical examiner. So he said, sure, no problem. Took his keys, ran out of the office. Heading downtown, there was no traffic on the road, which is not normal for New York City. There was a lot of quietness in the car. Marty and I was still kind of in shock. And then the next part was just the devastation that we witnessed at the medical examiner, which took hours down there. So that's a whole nother story. But, we arrived there, and it just was devastation all over. There was vans and cars, ambulances, I should say, that had deceased people in it. The medical examiner was shut down because they were kind of getting everything ready for the amount of people that were going to come in. And we were told, just stand off to the side, and once we know what's going on, we'll let you guys know. Long story short, we didn't get Father Judge until about 12:30 at night. So we were there from approximately 4:30 in the afternoon all the way to 12:30, which was fine. I was in no rush. I understood the circumstances. The sad part was that's when reality started sinking in, because we saw the number of deceased people that they had already picked up, whether it be off the street or they rescued and died. And then the medical examiners in between two hospitals, Bellevue and NYU, and we went to grab some water, and there was a whole bunch of doctors hanging out in the corner. They started talking to us. We started talking to them, and they were all trauma doctors, and they had nobody coming into the emergency room. With that said, we said, wow, this is just going to be crazy and out of control. And, unfortunately, as you know, over 3,000 people died. So it not that it was out of control, but it was just a very sad moment as a funeral director to kind of be there and live through that part of it.
Right. And Dominic, who was Father Judge?
Father Judge was the fire department chaplain for the entire New York City Fire Department. He was a Franciscan priest, very well known throughout the community in Lower Manhattan, and also served as their chaplain. So he developed a lot of relationships with the firefighters throughout his career, and even including the New York City Police Department. Just a very genuine, very caring man. So anytime there was a large fire or emergency in New York City, he would respond and be there for support for the firefighters. So as he did with, a regular fire, he responded to the World Trade Center that particular day. Unfortunately, winded up getting hit outside of the World Trade Center. He was in the courtyard. From what I understand, a brick had hit him in his head, and he was the first casualty of September 11th.
That was an intense first day of the attacks. Tell us about your role at Ground Zero and how you were able to help these families. You helped a lot of families.
We did. New York City being so diverse, and the business, Frankie Campbell, that I worked for, being a very diverse and very well-known funeral home, a lot of people reached out to us because they thought we had most of information over anyone else throughout the city. So, unfortunately, it was a lot of what I called stress phone calls where people just wanted to talk to someone and get answers. Not that the medical examiner wasn't sharing it, but he didn't have all the answers at the time as far as who was deceased and who was found and who was missing. And so it was a very challenging time for their staff there. And then families would call us saying, what do we do? How do we find out? So, I filtered most of the phone calls with my team there, and they did a great job as far as helping people just answer the basic questions. What's going to take place now? What do I do? And how do I move forward? So we thought, as probably most funeral homes did in New York, that we were going to be very busy in the first couple of days, which it was to a point with phone calls. But that was it. It was only phone calls because not a lot of people were found right away. So we were faced with the challenge of, okay, we have Father Judge. It's going to be a large-scale funeral. We don't know what else is going to come through the doors, but we hear there's other ones that were found and identified already, but there should be thousands more, not even hundreds, thousands. So, how are we going to tackle this? And the company did a great job. There was a gentleman by the name of Robert Budway who works for SCI, and he basically got a team together to help out funeral homes that would be overwhelmed with calls, and it was a great idea. It was wonderful for the locations, but most of us didn't need it because the volume was not there. So the calls came later on in the week and, of course, later on in the month, but it wasn't like we were hit. We serviced 75 families, but those 75 families were branched out over months. I mean, there was people that contacted us, made arrangements with us, and then we didn't find their loved one until 6 months later.
In many cases, you weren't able to recover, or they weren't able to recover, the remains of family members at all.
Correct.
How were you able to help them find closure and say goodbye in that case?
Well, that was the importance of memorializing someone. And, we were always on the front lines of it throughout cremation programs that we had and burial programs and things to that nature. But I said to my staff at the time, we have to give them every option no matter what, whether it's a full body or whether it's an inch part of a bone. It's still their loved one, and that's all they have. So whether it's an everyday worker, whether it's a firefighter, they're entitled to have the service that warrants their life, basically, how they live their life. And don't say, well, it's only a finger or it's only a hand. It's all they had, which was so important to the people, because there was some that had none. And that was the sad part. People would come to you and say, I have nothing. So there was funerals, with caskets, and there was funerals with tens of thousands of people. And I know what was in there. Some of the family knew that was in that casket, and that didn't matter to them. What mattered to them was they were representing their loved one and the life that they lived and being memorialized the way they thought was best fitting. And I have to tell you, it not from a point of revenue or anything like that. I don't care if people wanted something simple, they wanted something elaborate. The important part was to memorialize their loved one in a certain way. Certain people didn't think you can go to church. Certain people didn't think you can have a burial. And it was so important because after the fact that a family wrote you a letter or made a phone call, you realized how much you helped them through the process.
Right. And as a funeral director, you're used to dealing with sadness and grief on a daily basis, but never on this scale. How were you able to maintain your own composure and deal with your own grief through this process?
It was difficult. It's probably the first time that I broke down with families, which it's okay to cry as a funeral director. We always have this guard up that you can't cry, you can't show emotions. If you look at some photos of me on Google for some of these big funerals, I'm holding on to a wife, and there's tears coming down my eyes. And I said to myself one day, I said, there's nothing wrong with that. I normally would break down at nighttime, where I would leave the funeral home, probably work a 12, 15-hour day, and just take the long ride home. And that was my moment to have to myself and cry, get home, hug and kiss my kids, and start the day all over again the next day. So I grieved with them. I cried with them. As I told some people earlier in the funeral home, it's okay. It's okay to grieve with them. It's okay to break down. Yes, we're their main support. But these circumstances were so unique that you had no choice, and I didn't stop, and I would never stop anyone from holding back their emotions.
Right. No doubt this had a profound effect on you, and I would imagine you still think about some of these families and maybe even keep in touch with some of these families. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about that experience?
It was a moment in time that I will never forget. I relate to not only the people that I buried, but friends that I knew, or people that knew of people that died. So I relate to the whole tragic circumstances, including the Pentagon and Pennsylvania, all as one, and including the soldiers that are still fighting for this country. So I hold it dear to my heart. I do have my moments throughout the year, especially on 9/11, where, you'll see the reports, you'll hear the readings of the names, so you can relate to the people that you helped and the people that you knew of and the stories behind certain people. So it's a very, very, very difficult time. And like I said, we're all human. We all break down. And one thing I will share with you is, if anyone out there listening has not been to the memorial there, you must go to that memorial. It is the most touching memorial that has ever been created. Truly tells the story. And I didn't realize how much of an impact it had on me when I took my family there, my wife and my 2 kids. And my kids were young at the time, so now that they were in their 20s, they appreciated it. They knew the story more. They saw where I stood, in the midst of everything, and how I helped certain families. And I got to tell you, very, very powerful, very, talk about making an impact. It quite a unique museum to visit.
Dominic, who are you remembering today?
I'm remembering everyone out there. There's certain families that pop right into my head that, I can rattle off their names, which I don't do only because, there were some funerals that were held in confidentiality agreements that we had with the families, but some hold true very close to my heart that I still keep in touch with. But I remember every single victim, every single firefighter that fought, every police officer that fought, every deal worker that was down there, every soldier. I have a soft spot in my heart for everyone that was involved, and including the funeral directors. We're always the last ones to be thanked, and that's okay. We don't need to be on the front lines, but not only myself, but I know there's hundreds of ladies and guys that were out there day and night and helping families in their communities and in their states, not only New York, but New Jersey and Connecticut. And, I think of them too. And everyone just came together as one, did what was best, and no one should ever be forgotten. Whatever role they played, they should always be remembered.
Thank you for joining me today, Dominic, and for sharing your very moving experience and stories. Thank you for everything you did to serve families on September 11th, 2001, and what you and your profession do on a daily basis. It is truly profound, and we thank you for that.
Great, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share it.
Thank you again to all 4 of my guests for sharing these powerful stories of loss, grief, and resilience in the face of unbelievable adversity. And thank you to all of you and your colleagues for the role you played in helping families, communities, and our nation begin the healing process 20 years ago. We feel the effects of your efforts even today as we continue to mourn, reflect, and remember. And thank you for joining me today. For more information about remembering a life, Visit rememberingalife.com/share your story.